Welcome to Relative, our family mess. Here, I bring you the raw, unspoken stories of older men betrayed by the very families they spent a lifetime protecting, and the dark secrets hidden within the modern home. Now, here is today's story.
The frost had not fully lifted off Main Street when I stepped out that Tuesday morning, my breath fogging the cold October air, the same way it had for 31 years. I pulled my coat tighter and started my usual walk toward the pharmacy my father built, with his own two hands, the one I had spent my whole life keeping alive. I have made this walk more mornings than I could ever count. I know every crack in that sidewalk, every planter box outside the hardware store, every bench where old men gather to argue about weather and football. What I did not know yet, standing there in the gray morning light, was that something in this town had already shifted beneath my feet. The first person I passed was Carol Ann Whitfield. I delivered her youngest daughter's medicine through 3 straight winters of croup, driving it out to her farmhouse myself when the roads were too bad for her to come to town. She has waved at me every single morning for as long as I can remember, a small lift of her hand that never asked for anything and never expected anything back. That morning, she saw me from across the street, and instead of waving, she gathered her coat around herself and crossed to the other side, quickening her steps toward the post office, as though the wind had simply pushed her there. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was late for something. Maybe her mind was somewhere else entirely, the way minds tend to wander on a cold morning. I kept walking past the diner where the smell of coffee and bacon usually pulled me in for a few minutes of conversation before I opened my shop. Through the window, I saw 3 men I knew by name sitting in their usual booth. One of them glanced up, met my eyes for half a second, and then looked back down at his plate with a suddenness that felt like a door closing. By the time I reached the corner of 4th and Main, I had counted 5 people who would not look at me. 5 in a town where I have delivered babies' first fever medicine and held the hands of widowers picking up their late wives' final prescriptions. A town where I know which families take their blood pressure pills with breakfast and which ones forget until I call to remind them. I built my whole life on being the man this town could count on in the dark. I was not accustomed to being invisible in the daylight. There was a tightness building in my chest that I did not yet have a name for. It was not quite fear. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you walk into a room mid-conversation and everyone stops talking at once. You know something has happened. You simply do not know what. A truck rolled past behind me, tires hissing against the wet pavement, and the driver lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in the old country wave. For one brief second, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole morning. Then I saw his eyes catch mine in the side mirror, and the hand dropped back onto the wheel a half second too fast, and the truck picked up speed, like it was trying to put distance between us, before I could think to raise my own hand in return. I turned onto the last stretch of sidewalk before my shop, and that is when I saw it. A sheet of paper, official and stark white against the old brick, taped crookedly across the front door of Keene Family Pharmacy. From 20 feet away, I could see the seal at the top. Dark blue ink pressed into the shape of a state emblem. My legs kept moving, but everything else in me had gone very still, the way a man goes still. Right before he steps onto ice, he is not sure we'll hold him. I stood in front of my own door and read the words twice before they meant anything at all. Emergency suspension, pending investigation. Missouri State Board of Pharmacy. My hands that have counted out 31 years of pills, without once losing count, felt suddenly foreign to me, hanging useless at my sides. Behind me on the sidewalk, 2 women had stopped walking. They did not know I could hear them, or perhaps they simply did not care anymore whether I did. One of them said a name in a hushed voice, the kind of voice people use in church at funerals. Harold. Poor Harold Bell. The other one made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sigh, and said she had heard it happened right here in town, right under everybody's nose. I did not turn around. I could not make my body do it. I stood facing that locked door, my own name printed above it in gold letters I had paid for 20 years ago, and I felt the ground of my entire life begin to tilt. Harold Bell had been coming into my shop since before his hair turned gray. I knew the sound of his laugh from 3 aisles away. I knew he took his heart medicine at breakfast because his late wife had trained him to, and that he still called it her medicine, even 11 years after she was gone. Whatever had happened to Harold, whatever those women were whispering about behind me, with their hands pressed to their mouths, it was already wearing my name, like a coat that did not belong to me. I had no way of knowing yet just how far this was going to go, or how many people I loved were about to become part of the wreckage. I only knew that 31 years of trust could apparently vanish overnight, and that whatever storm had rolled through this town while I slept, it had chosen my door to knock on first. 2 weeks before any of it began, I woke before my alarm. The way I always do, made a pot of coffee I would only drink half of, and walk to the shop under a sky just beginning to lighten at the edges. There is a particular kind of quiet in Marlin Creek at that hour, before the diner opens and before the school buses start their rounds, and I have always loved it best. It is the only time of day this whole town belongs to nobody but the birds and the man sweeping his own sidewalk. The bell over my door has hung there since my father installed it. In 1974, a small brass thing gone slightly green with age, and it still rings the exact same note it did when I was a boy sweeping floors after school for a quarter an hour. I unlocked the front door that morning and let it swing open, and the bell rang its familiar note into the empty shop, and something in my chest settled the way it always did. Whatever troubles a man carries outside those walls, inside them, he becomes only what he was trained to be useful. On the counter, tucked beside the register where I would see her every single day, sat a small framed photograph of my late wife, Ruth, taken on the porch of our first house, the summer before I opened this place. She used to tease me that I loved the shop more than I loved sleeping in on Saturdays, and she was not entirely wrong. I touched the corner of that frame that morning, the way I touch it every morning, a small habit that has outlived the woman it honors by 4 years now. And I got to work. Beside my register next to the computer terminal that handles most of the paperwork these days sits a plain cloth-bound ledger, the newest in a stack of 31 identical volumes lined up in my back room, like soldiers standing at attention. Every single dispensing that leaves this counter I write down by hand, in my own script, alongside whatever the computer records. My father did it that way, because in his day, there was nothing else. I kept doing it long after computers made it unnecessary, because a machine can be wrong in ways a man's own memory rarely is. I have never once in 31 years found the two records disagree with each other. I did not yet know how badly I would need that ledger, or how soon. Trevor Nash came in at 8 sharp, same as always, shaking the cold off his jacket and grinning at me, the way he had been grinning at me since the day I hired him fresh out of pharmacy school 6 years earlier. I trained that young man with these two hands. I taught him how to read a doctor's terrible handwriting, how to spot a forged prescription before it ever reached the counter, how to talk a frightened new mother through her infant's first course of antibiotics without letting his voice show that he was just as nervous as she was. He had a gift for it, a natural warmth that made even the crankiest old farmers in this county trust him within the first 5 minutes of meeting him. That morning, we worked side by side the way we had 1,000 mornings before, filling orders, chatting between customers. A woman named Ellen Mercer came in for her grandson's asthma inhaler and Trevor crouched down at the boy's eye level, showing him how to use it properly, turning the whole ordeal into something like a game. I watched him do it and felt something close to pride. Around noon, once the morning rush had cleared, I sat him down in the back office and told him what I had been turning over in my mind for the better part of a year. I told him I was not getting any younger, and that someday, sooner than either of us might like to admit, this shop would need someone who could run it without me standing over his shoulder. I told him I wanted to make him junior partner effective that week, and that along with the title would come real authority, oversight of our supplier accounts, access to the full dispensing records, the kind of trust I had never extended to anyone outside my own family. Trevor's eyes went bright in a way that made my own chest ache with something like fatherly satisfaction. He shook my hand across that old desk and told me it was the honor of his life that he would not let me down, that he understood exactly what this place meant to this town and to me. I believed every word of it. I had no reason not to. I locked up that evening with the particular contentment of a man who believes he has finally, after 31 years, built something that will outlast him. Walking home that night, I passed my son Daniel's old apartment building out of habit, though he had not lived there in over a year, and I felt the familiar small ache of a relationship I had let grow thin without quite meaning to. Daniel worked as a nurse now, up at the clinic on the edge of town, a good and steady profession that made me proud in ways I had never found the right words to tell him. We spoke maybe once a month by then, brief and polite conversations that never seemed to land on anything real. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold beside me, looking over the day's ledger entries one final time before bed, the way I had done every single night since I was young enough to still be learning the trade from my father's own hand. Every name matched. Every dose matched. It was in every way I could measure an entirely ordinary day. Harold Bell walked through my door 3 days after I made Trevor a partner, same as he had walked through it on the second Thursday of nearly every month for the past 11 years. Right on schedule, his old canvas jacket smelling faintly of wood smoke from whatever he had been burning in his fireplace the night before. He set both hands flat on my counter, the way he always did, like a man settling in for a conversation rather than a transaction, and grinned at me with a gap-toothed smile that had not changed one bit since we were both young enough to think we would live forever. We had known each other since grade school, Harold and I, two boys from opposite ends of the county who ended up in the same homeroom and never quite managed to shake each other loose after that. He had farmed corn and soybeans, his whole working life, retired now for 6 years, and he filled his days the way a lot of men his age do around here, puttering in his shed, feeding the birds. His late wife used to feed driving into town most weeks, just to have somebody to talk to. That afternoon, he told me about the new fellow up at the clinic, a doctor he had started seeing after his regular physician retired and moved down to Florida to be closer to grandchildren. He said the new doctor was thorough, maybe a little too thorough. Running tests Harold did not entirely understand, and adjusting his medications more often than he was used to. He mentioned almost as an afterthought, while I counted out his usual refill, that they had added something new for his back the month before, on top of everything else he was already taking. I asked him how the new pills were sitting with him, the way I ask every patient who mentions a change out of habit, as much as genuine concern. He said he felt a little foggier some mornings than he used to, a little slower getting his feet under him, but he chalked it up to age and did not seem particularly worried about it. I made a small note to check the interaction between his new prescription and his existing ones, a routine courtesy I extended to every regular customer taking multiple medications, and found nothing in our system that raised any flags. Whatever this new doctor had prescribed, it was not something showing up in any record I had access to. We talked for a good 20 minutes that afternoon, longer than a simple pickup required about nothing in particular. He told me about a fishing trip he was planning for the spring, some lake up near the Arkansas line, where his brother used to take him as a boy. I told him about a book Ruth used to love that I had finally worked up the courage to reread, and he teased me gently for taking 4 years to get there. He laughed at something Trevor said from across the shop, and Trevor laughed right back, easy and warm, the two of them getting along the way. Trevor got along with nearly everyone in this town. Before he left, Harold leaned in a little and lowered his voice the way men our age do when they want to say something without making a fuss of it. He said he appreciated a place like mine, still existing, a place where somebody actually knew your name and your history, instead of just your insurance number. He said the new clinic was efficient enough, but it never felt like this. I told him I appreciated him saying so, and I meant it more than I let on. Harold clapped me on the shoulder on his way out, told me to take care of myself, and said he would see me next month, same as always. I did not see him next month. 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, I remember mostly for how ordinary it felt. Right up until the moment it stopped being ordinary, I got a call from Harold's niece, a young woman named Beth, who lived 2 counties over and had always been the one to check on him since his wife passed. Her voice on the phone was thin and shaking in a way I recognized immediately, the particular sound of someone forcing themselves to stay composed long enough to get the words out. She told me she had not been able to reach him in 2 days, had driven over that morning to check, and had found him in his recliner in front of a television that was still playing Gone. The coroner said sometime the night before. I stood in my kitchen holding that phone for a long moment after she hung up, unable to fully absorb what I had just heard. Harold Bell gone. Harold Bell, who had sat at my counter 4 days earlier, telling me about a fishing trip he was planning for a spring he would not live to see. I thought of him the way I think of most losses in this business, with a grief that is real but familiar, the particular ache of a man who has spent his whole career loving people he eventually loses. I had no way of knowing, standing there in my kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand, that Harold's death was not the end of the story I would find myself living inside. I thought I was grieving a friend. I did not yet understand that I was standing at the very beginning of something that would soon threaten to take everything else I had left. The autopsy results came back within the week, faster than I had ever known such things to move in a county where the coroner's office handled maybe a dozen cases a year and usually took its time about all of them. The cause of death was listed as acute opioid toxicity, a phrase that meant nothing to me the first time I read it in the newspaper, and everything to me the second time, once I understood what it was going to mean for the rest of my life. 2 days after that, notice ran a man I had never met walked into my shop, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck, introduced himself as Gordon Slate, and told me he was the regional operations director for Meridian Health Group. He had the kind of handshake that lingers a half second, too long, firm and warm and entirely calculated, and a smile that never quite made it up into his eyes. He said he had heard about Harold, offered his condolences in a tone so smooth it barely sounded like anything at all, and asked if we might sit down somewhere private to talk. I took him into my back office out of nothing more than old-fashioned manners, the same manners that have gotten me into more than a little trouble over the years. He told me Meridian had been quietly expanding through this part of the state, absorbing independent pharmacies and clinics into a single integrated network, and that they had in fact already had their eye on my shop before any of this happened. He mentioned a figure, a number large enough to make most men my age consider retirement without a second thought, and slid a business card across my desk with a private line printed beneath his name. He said the timing was unfortunate, that he understood a man my age might be shaken by a tragedy involving a longtime patient, and that Meridian would be more than willing to make me a generous offer that would let me step back and rest no further obligation required. I told him as politely as I could manage that I had no intention of selling anything. I told him I had built this shop with my own hands and buried my wife 2 blocks from its front door, and that neither Harold's death nor his very generous offer changed a single thing about my plans for the future. Slate nodded along the whole time I spoke, the way a patient man nods at a child who has not yet grasped how the world actually works, and told me he understood completely, that the offer would remain open, and that he hoped we could stay in touch as circumstances developed. He buttoned his jacket and told me on his way out that grief has a way of changing a man's mind faster than logic ever could. I did not like the phrase circumstances developed. There was something about the way he said it, smooth and unhurried, like a man who already knew how the story was going to end. I did not know yet how right I was to distrust it. That same afternoon, once Slate had gone, the State Board of Pharmacy called to inform me that given the nature of Harold's death and his status as one of my regular patients, they would be conducting a routine review of my dispensing records related to his prescriptions. It was standard procedure. The woman on the phone assured me nothing to be alarmed about, simply a box that needed checking whenever a fatality involved controlled substances and a known pharmacy relationship. She said someone would need access to pull the relevant digital records within the next few days. Trevor was standing beside me when I hung up the phone, and he must have seen something in my face, because he put a hand on my shoulder and told me not to worry about a thing. He said he would handle the whole review personally, pull whatever records the board needed, make sure everything was organized and presented properly, so there would be no confusion or delay. He said I had enough weighing on me, already grieving a friend, and that this was exactly the kind of burden a junior partner was supposed to lift off an old man's shoulders. He even offered to stay late that night, getting a head start on it, so the board would have everything they needed well before their deadline. I remember feeling in that moment something close to relief. I remember thinking that the trust I had placed in him 3 weeks earlier, handing him full access to our dispensing system, had already proven itself worthwhile, a young man stepping forward exactly when I needed him to. I signed the authorization form that afternoon, granting the board access to our records through Trevor as the designated point of contact, and I went home that night, believing with my whole heart that I had nothing left to fear from a process that existed only to confirm what I already knew to be true. I even remember thanking God quietly in my own kitchen that I had a young man like Trevor beside me to shoulder something this heavy. I had spent so many years worrying about who would carry this place forward once I could not, and here he was, carrying it before I had even asked. I had no way of knowing that I had just handed the only man with unrestricted access to my dispensing system the exact window of time he would need to make sure the record said something entirely different from what actually happened. 5 days after Slate walked out of my shop with his business card still sitting on my desk, I received a call asking me to come in for what the caller described as a routine compliance interview at the regional board office in Springfield, a little over an hour's drive from Marlin Creek. I remember thinking on the drive down that this was simply the last formality before the whole business was closed out, a box checked and forgotten. I remember being almost relaxed about it, the particular calm of a man who believes with his whole heart that he has nothing to hide. The woman who greeted me in that small gray conference room introduced herself as a compliance officer for the board, polite but entirely businesslike, the kind of professional courtesy that gives away nothing about what is coming. She had a laptop open in front of her and a manila folder beside it, and she asked me to sit, offered me water I did not want, and told me she needed to walk me through some records before we could close the file. She turned the laptop screen to face me, and I saw a transaction log, clean and official-looking, time-stamped the Tuesday before Harold died. It showed a dispensing entry under my personal credentials, a quantity of oxycodone, well beyond what any reasonable prescription would call for, filled and released from my pharmacy, my digital signature attached at the bottom, the way it is attached to every legitimate transaction I have ever completed. I stared at that screen for a long moment, without saying anything at all, because for the first several seconds, my mind simply refused to accept what my eyes were showing it. I had not filled that prescription. I had never seen that quantity, that date, that particular combination of numbers before in my life. And yet there, it was my own credentials sitting beneath it, like a confession I had never made. I told her as steadily as I could manage that I had no memory of that transaction. She asked me, not unkindly, whether it was possible I had simply forgotten, given the volume of patients I saw in an average week. I told her I remembered Harold's visit that week, clearly that I had filled his usual monthly refill, and nothing more, that I could not have dispensed a quantity like that, without noticing it myself, without my own ledger reflecting it. I told her that in 31 years, I had never once mixed up a patient's dosage, that a man does not forget handing someone enough medication to kill him. She asked me if I kept a separate ledger. I told her I did, that I had kept one every single day for 31 years, and that I would bring it to her the moment I returned home. She wrote something down unhurried, and I found myself watching her pen, the way a man watches a verdict being written before it is read aloud. She made a note of that, her expression unreadable, and then she showed me something else. A second document, this one, a printed prescription form, bearing a signature that looked at a passing glance almost exactly like my own. I have signed my name tens of thousands of times across 31 years of practice. I know the particular slant of my own hand, the small hook at the end of the K in Keen, that I have written the exact same way since I was a young man. This signature had that hook. It had my slant. And I had absolutely no memory of ever putting pen to that particular piece of paper. I asked her, my voice rising slightly, despite every effort to keep it level, how a signature could exist for a transaction I never performed. She told me with the careful neutrality of someone who has delivered difficult news many times before, that the board's investigation was ongoing, that discrepancies like this were exactly why they conducted these interviews, and that I would be informed of next steps once their review was complete. She did not accuse me outright. She did not need to. The silence in that room did the accusing for her, and I sat there a moment longer than I should have, waiting for her to say something that never came. I drove home that evening replaying every second of that conversation, my hands gripping the wheel, the way a man grips something to keep from shaking apart entirely. I had not done what that record claimed I had done. I knew that with a certainty that lived somewhere deeper than memory, in the same place a man knows his own name or the sound of his late wife's voice. But knowing a thing in your bones and proving it to a room full of strangers holding a printed signature that looks exactly like yours are two very different battles. And I understood driving through the dark toward a home that no longer felt entirely safe, that I had just been handed the second one without ever agreeing to fight it. I did not do this. That single sentence repeated itself over and over in my mind, the whole drive home quiet and unwavering, the one solid thing I still had to stand on. I did not do this, but somewhere between my own hand and that laptop screen, someone had made absolutely certain it would look like I had, and I had no earthly idea driving home in the dark, that night, exactly how far that someone was willing to go to make the lie hold. The Marlin Creek Gazette runs once a week, 8 pages on a good week, and I have read every single issue since before I could legally buy the beer advertised in its back pages. That Thursday, 3 days after I stood outside my own locked door, reading a notice, I still could not fully believe my name appeared above the fold for the first time in 31 years, and not for anything I would have wished for. Local pharmacist under investigation. In overdose death, the headline read, and beneath it a photograph of my shop front, taken from across the street, the paper notice still taped crookedly to the glass. I read the article standing in my own kitchen, coffee going cold beside me, and felt something in my chest crack a little further with every paragraph. The piece was careful, technically fair, full of phrases like allegedly and under review, and no charges have been filed. None of that carefulness mattered. A man's whole life can be undone by a headline, regardless of how many qualifying words the writer tucks beneath it. And I understood that morning, reading my own name printed beside the word overdose, exactly how thin the fabric of a reputation really is. I did not leave the house for 2 full days after that article ran. When I finally did, walking down to the post office, because I could not bear the thought of my mail piling up unattended, I felt the whole town rearrange itself around me, the way water rearranges itself around a stone, dropped into a still pond. People I had known my entire life found sudden, urgent business on the opposite sidewalk. A woman I had once sat with in a hospital waiting room through her husband's bypass surgery would not meet my eyes over the top of her grocery cart. The one exception, the single steady thing in a town that had gone soft and strange around me, was Della Mae Prentice. She has run the diner on Main Street for as long as I can remember, a heavy-set woman with a laugh that carries clear across the room and a memory for orders that has never once failed her. When I walked past her window that second day out, she came outside, without her coat, stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and told me loud enough for anyone nearby to hear if they cared to, that there was a cup of coffee waiting for me any morning I wanted it, and that she had known me too long to believe a piece of paper over her own 2 eyes. I did not take her up on the coffee that day. I did not trust myself yet to sit in a public window and be looked at even kindly. But I carried the offer home with me, like a small, warm stone in my pocket, the one thing that made the walk back feel survivable. That evening I called my son. Daniel picked up on the 4th ring, his voice careful in a way that had become familiar over our recent years apart, but that now carried something new underneath it, something closer to distance than distraction. I told him what had happened, the suspension, the article, the accusation I still could not make sense of. I waited for him to say something, anything that sounded like his mother's son standing up for me, the way I had always imagined a child would. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and careful in a way that felt worse than anger would have. He told me he had already heard that people at the clinic were talking about it, and that he thought it might be best if we did not discuss it over the phone. He said he needed time to process everything himself. He said he had to go, that he had an early shift, and the call ended before I could ask him what exactly there was to process about his own father being wrongly accused. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call, the phone still warm in my hand, turning over every possible explanation for what I had just heard in my son's voice. Perhaps he believed what the town believed. Perhaps working at the clinic that had so recently tried to buy my shop had put him in some position I did not understand, some loyalty I could not see the shape of from where I sat. I had no answers, only the particular ache of a father who has just watched his own child step back from him at the exact moment he needed him closest. I sat there long enough for the kitchen to grow dark around me, long enough to feel something close to doubt creep in, where certainty had stood only days before. Perhaps I truly had made some mistake I could no longer remember making. Perhaps age had finally caught up with the parts of my mind I trusted most. It was a dangerous thought, and I let myself sit inside it for longer than I should have, until something in the back of my mind, stubborn and quiet, refused to let the doubt finish taking root. I thought of my ledger, sitting exactly where it always sat. 31 years of my own handwriting, stacked in that back room like a witness who had never once lied to me. Whatever else this town believed, whatever my own son could not bring himself to say, that ledger knew the truth of every single day I had lived inside these walls, and I understood, sitting alone in my darkened kitchen, that it was time to go find out exactly what it had to say. I did not wait for morning. Some things a man cannot sit with overnight, and the not knowing had already cost me enough sleep for one lifetime. I got up from that dark kitchen table, turned on every light in the house, the way I have not done since I was a boy, afraid of shadows, and drove back down to the shop with a key I had not used since the notice went up on my door. The back room of Keene Family Pharmacy smells the way it has always smelled: paper and old wood and the faint chemical sweetness of the storage shelves, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, just breathing it in, before I let myself approach the shelf, where 31 years of my own handwriting waited in neat cloth-bound rows. I pulled down the current volume, the one I had been writing in that very week, and carried it to the small desk in the corner under a single bare bulb. I found the date easily enough. The compliance officer had said the Tuesday before Harold died, and I flipped to that week with hands that were not entirely steady. I ran my finger down the column of entries, name after name after name, in my own careful script. Patience, I could picture clearly, even without the names attached, the small daily record of an entirely ordinary week. There was no entry for Harold Bell that Tuesday, nothing close to the quantity they claimed I had dispensed, nothing at all that resembled the transaction sitting on that laptop screen in Springfield. My hands, which had been shaking slightly when I opened the book, went suddenly still. The particular stillness of a man who has just found the first solid ground beneath him in days. But an absence in my own ledger only proved what I already knew in my bones, that I had not written such an entry down. It did not yet prove I could not have made the dispensing itself, and simply failed to record it, however unthinkable that possibility was to me. I needed something harder than my own handwriting. I needed proof that I had not even been standing behind that counter at all on the day in question. I sat back in that hard wooden chair and closed my eyes, forcing my mind backward through the calendar, the way I had forced it backward through the 2 weeks leading up to Harold's visit. Tuesday. The Tuesday before Harold died. My mind circled the date twice, and then landed on something with a small jolt of recognition that felt almost physical. That was conference week. Every autumn for the past 19 years, I have driven 3 counties over to Rolla for the annual meeting of the Ozark Independent Pharmacists Association, a gathering of maybe 60 of us from small towns scattered across this part of the state, trading notes on supplier prices and new regulations over bad hotel coffee. I had gone that week, same as every year, checked into the same tired chain hotel off the interstate, sat through 2 full days of sessions with dozens of other pharmacists who would remember seeing me there. I opened the desk drawer where I keep old receipts out of a lifetime habit of never throwing away a piece of paper that might someday matter, and there, exactly where I hoped it would be, sat the folded conference program from that very week, my name printed on the attendee roster. Inside the front cover, a hotel receipt paper-clipped to the back page showing a 2-night stay charged to my account. The dates were right there in black and white. I had been standing in a windowless conference room in Rolla, Missouri, listening to a lecture on Medicare billing changes at almost the exact hour that laptop screen claimed I had been dispensing a lethal dose of oxycodone to my oldest friend, 3 counties, and over an hour's drive away. I sat there for a long moment with that receipt in my hand, feeling something shift inside my chest for the first time since I had stood outside my own locked door. It was not relief exactly, not yet. It was something closer to the first foothold a drowning man finds on a rock he was certain did not exist a moment earlier. I was not losing my mind. I was not misremembering my own actions. Someone somewhere had built a lie detailed enough to include a signature that matched my own hand, and that lie had a hole in it. Now a small one, but a real one. I sat with that thought a long while, turning it over, the way I turn over any problem that matters slowly, and from every angle. My own memory and a folded conference program might be enough to convince a jury of my own family, the people who already knew my character well enough to trust it. But the compliance officer in Springfield had not known me for 31 years. She had a printed signature and a time-stamped digital record, both of which looked to any stranger's eye considerably more official than an old man's handwritten ledger and a hotel receipt he happened to save. I understood sitting there under that single bare bulb, with the evidence of my own innocence spread across the desk in front of me, that proving where I had been was only half the battle. Somebody had reached into a system I trusted and planted a lie precise enough to wear my own signature. Until I could show exactly how that lie had been built, and by whose hand, my truth was still only a whisper standing against a printed page that the whole town had already chosen to believe. I called an old classmate the next morning, a man named Wendell Fitch I had gone through pharmacy school with back in the 70s, who had spent his last working years serving on various state committees before retiring out to a lake house 2 hours south. Wendell had always kept better track of the regulatory side of our profession than I ever cared to, and I trusted him to tell me straight whether I had any real ground to stand on, or whether I was simply an old man clutching at a hotel receipt in a losing fight. He listened to the whole story without interrupting the way a good doctor listens to symptoms before offering a diagnosis, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before he told me I needed to talk to someone specific, not just any board employee. He gave me a name. Nora Whitman, an investigator who worked drug diversion cases for the state, a woman he described as sharp enough to see through nonsense and stubborn enough not to let a case go once she believed something was wrong with it. He said if anyone in that whole system would actually look at what I had, rather than simply process what the file already said, it would be her. I called the number he gave me before I lost my nerve, and to my surprise, she answered her own phone on the second ring. I explained who I was braced for the same careful neutrality I had gotten from the compliance officer in Springfield, and instead heard something different in her voice, a kind of alertness that felt less like procedure and more like genuine interest. She asked me to bring everything I had to her office in Jefferson City the following morning, first thing, before she started anything else that day. Nora Whitman turned out to be a compact woman, somewhere in her 40s, gray threading through dark hair she wore, pulled back plain and practical, with the kind of handshake that meant business rather than performance. Her office was cluttered in the particular way of someone who trusts her own filing system more than she trusts appearances. Stacks of folders arranged in some order. Only she understood a framed photograph of 2 teenage boys, angled where she could see it from her desk. She sat me down, spread my conference program and hotel receipt across her desk, and studied them for a long, silent minute, before looking up at me with an expression I had not seen directed at me in weeks. She looked like she believed me. She asked careful questions, the kind that told me she had done this 100 times before and had learned exactly which details separated a genuine mistake from a manufactured one. How many people had access to my dispensing terminal? Whether anyone had asked to review records around the time in question? Whether anything in the weeks before Harold's death had struck me as unusual, however small? She told me the timestamp on the digital transaction was specific enough to check against my documented location, and that if my hotel records held up under verification, it would raise a serious question the board could not simply wave away. But she also told me something that settled into my stomach, like a stone dropped into still water. She explained that dispensing systems like mine required an authenticated login tied to a specific credential, and that whoever created that fraudulent entry had not simply guessed at my signature from across the internet. They had needed access to my actual system from inside my actual pharmacy using either my own login or one with equivalent authority. I asked her what that meant in plain terms. She looked at me steadily and told me it meant the person responsible for that record was very likely someone who had legitimate access to my dispensing terminal, someone I had trusted enough to let inside the walls of my own business. She did not say a name. She did not need to. There was exactly one person on this earth, besides myself, who held that kind of access, and the moment the thought fully formed in my mind, I felt something in my chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of that office. I told her about Trevor, my voice unsteady in a way I had not allowed it to be in front of the compliance officer, or the newspaper, or even my own son. I told her I had trained that young man with my own 2 hands, had made him partner. Not 3 weeks before any of this began, had handed him full access to my system out of nothing but trust and pride in what he had become. Nora listened without interrupting the same careful listening Wendell had given me the day before, and when I finished, she told me gently that trust was exactly the thing people like whoever did this counted on most. I drove home from Jefferson City that afternoon, with the window cracked, despite the cold needing the air on my face to keep my thoughts from closing in on me entirely. I did not want to believe what Nora's explanation was pointing toward. I had watched Trevor crouch down at a frightened child's eye level and make an asthma inhaler feel like a game. I had shaken his hand across my own desk and felt something close to a father's pride, and now I was driving home, turning over a single question that felt too monstrous to hold on to and impossible to set back down. Who in my own pharmacy I asked the empty road ahead of me, wanted the whole world to believe I was a killer. Nora called me 3 days later, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone about to deliver news they already know will hurt. She told me she had spent that time doing what she called routine background work, the kind of digging that turns up nothing 9 times out of 10, but occasionally cracks a case wide open on the 10th. She asked if I was sitting down. I told her I'd been sitting down in one way or another since the morning I found that notice taped to my own front door. She started with the public records, the kind anyone can pull if they know where to look and have a reason to be looking. Trevor Nash, it turned out, had accumulated a considerable amount of debt over the past 2 years, most of it tied to a riverboat casino 3 hours east across the state line, the sort of place a young man might visit once for the novelty of it and never quite manage to leave behind. There were collection notices filed against him, 2 of them escalating toward legal action, and a private loan from a source Nora described only as unregulated, the kind of lender who does not send polite reminder letters when a payment goes missing. I sat with the phone pressed hard against my ear, feeling something in my chest curl inward, the way paper curls when it meets a flame. I had known Trevor for 6 years. I had eaten dinner at his kitchen table more times than I could count, had watched him fall in love with a schoolteacher named Amy, and stood up as a witness at their courthouse wedding 2 years back. Not once in all that time had he given me the smallest sign that his life was quietly coming apart at the seams behind a smile I had trusted without question. Nora was not finished. She told me the debt alone explained motive, but it did not explain opportunity, and opportunity was the piece that had taken her the extra day to confirm. She had requested banking records tied to the fraudulent transaction date, using channels available to her through the ongoing investigation, and had found a deposit into Trevor's personal account 11 days before Harold's death, a payment of $4,000 from an account registered to a consulting entity called Lumina Regional Advisors. I asked her what that entity was. She told me it took her most of the afternoon to trace it back through 2 layers of shell registration, but that Lumina Regional Advisors ultimately connected through a chain of ownership that was clearly designed to be difficult to follow to Meridian Health Group. The same company. The same Gordon Slate, who had walked into my shop with his expensive suit and his very generous offer. 5 days before I was called in to look at a laptop screen showing a lie with my name signed at the bottom. I did not say anything for a long moment. I sat in my own kitchen, the same table where I had sat, turning over doubt about my own son only nights before, and felt the full shape of what Nora was describing settle over me like a shadow crossing a field. Trevor had not simply stumbled into betraying me out of some private grievance I never saw coming. Someone had found a drowning man and offered him exactly enough money to make betrayal feel like survival, and that someone had known precisely which door in my own shop to knock on. Nora told me gently that she wanted to be clear about what this evidence did and did not prove. It showed Trevor had motive financial desperation deep enough to make a bad decision feel survivable. It showed a payment from a company connected to Meridian around the right window of time. It did not yet prove in a way that would satisfy a formal hearing that Trevor had actually altered the digital record himself, though the access question from our previous conversation made him by far the most likely hand behind it. She said we needed more something that connected the money directly to the act, not merely to the timing. I thanked her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, and hung up the phone with a strange new stillness settling over the anger I had expected to feel. I had spent days imagining Trevor as the whole of my betrayal, the singular face of everything that had been done to me. Now I understood he was something smaller, and in its own way something sadder than that. A young man drowning in debt, handed a lifeline by someone who understood exactly how to make that lifeline look like a favor rather than a weapon. I thought of Slate's handshake. The half-second too long, the smile that never reached his eyes, the card he had left sitting on my desk, like a promise disguised as a courtesy. Trevor had signed the forged record. Trevor had access motive, and now a very specific sum of money to explain both. But Trevor was not the kind of man who built shell companies 3 layers deep to hide a payment, and Trevor certainly was not the kind of man who had spent months quietly circling my shop with an offer to buy it out from under me before any of this ever began. If Trevor was the knife that had been used against me, I sat there in my kitchen, finally understanding the shape of the true question I needed answered. Whose hand had been holding it? And what exactly did that hand want badly enough to spend this much money and this much patience trying to take it from me? Nora asked me to come back to Jefferson City 5 days later, and this time she did not wait for me to sit down before she started talking. She had a folder in her hands, thicker than the one from our first meeting, and something in the set of her shoulders told me before she said a single word that whatever she had found was worse than anything we had uncovered so far. She told me she had used her authority as part of the ongoing investigation to subpoena Harold's complete treatment records from the Meridian Clinic, the full history, rather than the fragments any of us had seen before. She spread the pages across her desk and walked me through them one at a time, and with every page, my understanding of what had actually happened to my oldest friend shifted further from anything I had imagined. Harold's new doctor at the clinic, a man named Dr. Aldous Reyes, had increased his pain medication 4 separate times over the 6 weeks before his death. Each increase larger than sound medical practice would typically call for each one layered on top of medications he was already taking for his heart and his blood pressure. The combination Nora explained was the kind of thing a careful physician would have flagged immediately. Dangerous not because any single prescription was extreme on its own, but because the layered total building, week over week, had pushed Harold's system toward exactly the kind of failure that had killed him. I sat there staring at those pages, feeling something colder than anger settle into the center of my chest. Harold had not died because of anything that happened at my counter. Harold had died because the very clinic he trusted to look after him in his old age had been quietly, systematically poisoning him one adjustment at a time. and somebody inside that same organization had known exactly what those records would show, if anyone with real authority ever thought to look closely. Nora was not finished. She told me Harold wasn't an isolated case. Working with a colleague on the federal side, she had identified a pattern across a cluster of elderly patients at that same clinic, all of them managed by the same handful of prescribers, all of them showing the identical signature of escalating doses that exceeded any reasonable standard of care. Several were still alive. All of them, she said, were currently at risk of the exact same fate that had already taken Harold from me. She explained what she believed had actually happened, piecing it together the way a woman pieces together a puzzle she has spent her whole career learning to read. The Drug Enforcement Administration had flagged Meridian's regional prescribing patterns for a routine audit scheduled to begin within weeks, a review that would have exposed the clinic's reckless overprescribing across dozens of patients, Harold's death chief, among the evidence any investigator would have found first. Someone at Meridian, faced with the collapse of that audit into something far worse than a licensing headache, had needed a different story ready before federal eyes ever reached the file. A grieving old pharmacist, trusted by the whole town, suddenly appearing to have made a fatal error, was exactly the kind of clean and simple explanation that could close a case before anyone thought to look upstream at the clinic itself. I was not being punished for anything I had done. I understood that now, with a clarity that felt almost physical, settling into my bones, the way cold settles into old joints before a storm. I was simply convenient. 31 years of trust, the very reputation I had spent my whole life building, had made me the perfect vessel for someone else's lie. Because a town that trusted me completely would also once shown a signature and a timestamp, believed just as completely that I had betrayed that trust. I asked Nora, my voice barely holding steady, how many other patients she believed were still being harmed inside that clinic, while we sat there discussing the shape of the lie built to protect it. She told me she did not have an exact number, yet only a pattern strong enough to worry her deeply. Strong enough that she had already begun quietly building a broader case that went well beyond my own situation, one she could not yet bring forward publicly without the kind of hard evidence that would hold up under real scrutiny. I sat in that cluttered office for a long time after she finished speaking, staring at a stack of medical records that had just rewritten the entire shape of my grief. I had spent weeks believing this fight was about clearing my own name, about proving to a town that had turned its back on me that I was still the man they had always known. I understood now that the stakes had grown into something far larger than my own reputation, larger even than the memory of my oldest friend. Somewhere in this county right now, other frightened old men and women were sitting in their own kitchens, taking pills a corrupted system had convinced them were keeping them alive, when in truth, those very pills were quietly closing in on them the exact same way they had closed in on Harold. This was no longer only my fight to clear my name and reclaim my shop. It had become something with real weight attached to every day we did not act, and I understood, sitting in that office as the afternoon light faded outside Nora's window, that I could no longer afford to think of this only in terms of my own survival. Nora walked me through what she called the 2 roads forward before I left her office that evening, laying them out with the same careful precision she had used to lay out every piece of evidence before it. The first road was simple, and she did not pretend otherwise. My conference documentation, once formally verified, would very likely be enough on its own to clear the suspension and close the investigation against me. The board would issue a quiet correction. The newspaper might run a small follow-up story, 3 paragraphs on page 4, and within a season or 2 the whole town would remember this as an unfortunate mix-up rather than the wound it had actually been. I could reopen my shop, rebuild what trust I could, and let the rest of it, the clinic, the doctor, the other patients Nora suspected were still in danger, become someone else's fight to finish. The second road was slower and considerably more dangerous to my own peace of mind. If I wanted to see Meridian's operation exposed in full, if I wanted the DEA audit to land with the full weight of everything Nora had uncovered, rather than a sanitized story about one confused old man, I would need to let this play out longer. I would need to remain in the eyes of the town, and possibly in the eyes of Meridian itself, a broken man who had accepted defeat. While Nora and I quietly built a case strong enough to survive a courtroom, rather than merely satisfy my own wounded pride, I drove home that night without any clear answer in mind, and found myself, as I often do, when a decision feels too large to hold standing at Ruth's grave, before I had fully decided to go there at all. The cemetery sits on a low hill just outside town, and I have walked that path so many times over the past 4 years that my feet seem to know the way, even when my mind is elsewhere entirely. I stood there in the cold for a long while, telling her everything, the way I have told her everything, since the day we buried her. The suspension, the forged record, Trevor's debt, the clinic, Harold. Ruth had a particular kind of moral clarity that I have spent my whole life admiring, and only occasionally matching a way of seeing straight through a complicated situation to the one question that actually mattered underneath it. She would not have asked me whether clearing my own name was enough. She would have asked me what I was willing to endure so that some other old man's family did not have to bury him the way we had just buried Harold. I thought about the patients Nora had described, faces I did not know, attached to a pattern of numbers on a page sitting in kitchens, not unlike my own, trusting a system that was quietly working against them, the same way it had worked against Harold. I thought about how easily this could have been prevented if someone at any point along the way had been willing to endure a little more discomfort in service of a larger truth. I did not want to be the man who had the chance to stop something like this, and chose his own comfort instead. By the time I left that hillside, the decision had settled into me, with a kind of quiet finality that felt less like a choice, and more like something I had simply recognized as already true. I would take the second road. I would let this town continue believing for as long as it needed to, that I was a broken old man who had accepted his own guilt and quietly stepped aside. I would let Meridian believe the same thing, believe it thoroughly enough that they let their guard down, believe it thoroughly enough that whatever they were still hiding would surface on its own once they no longer feared anyone was looking. I called Nora the next morning and told her my decision. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that sounded almost like respect, though she was careful as always to keep her tone professional. She told me that if I meant to go through with this, I would need to do more than simply stay quiet. I would need to actively appear to surrender publicly and convincingly enough that no one, especially not Trevor or Slate, ever suspected I was doing anything other than accepting defeat. I understood what she was asking of me, and I understood, standing in my own kitchen with the phone against my ear, that it would be the hardest performance of my life. I had spent 31 years being known in this town as a man who never once bent to pressure he did not believe was right. Now I would need to let that same town watch me appear to bend completely, would need to let Trevor and Slate believe their lie had finally fully succeeded all, so that when the truth eventually surfaced, it would surface with enough weight behind it to protect every patient still standing in harm's way. I told Nora I was ready. I did not entirely believe myself as I said it, but I said it anyway. The way a man says a thing he has already decided must be true, regardless of how steady his voice sounds while he says it. Somewhere on that hillside, standing over Ruth's grave in the cold, I had already made the harder promise. Everything after that was simply the work of keeping it. I called Gordon Slate myself 2 mornings later and I will admit that dialing his number felt almost like swallowing something bitter on purpose. I told him I had thought long and hard about his offer, that recent events had made clear a man my age needed to consider his limitations, and that I was prepared to discuss terms for selling the shop after all. I let my voice waver in exactly the places a genuinely broken man's voice might waver, a skill I did not know I possessed until I found myself needing it. He came to my house that same afternoon, rather than making me travel to him, which told me something about how eager he was to close this particular door before I could change my mind. He sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the same table where I had spent so many recent nights wrestling with doubt, and slid a folder of preliminary paperwork toward me, with a smile that had finally, for the first time since I met him, reached all the way up into his eyes. I played my part carefully, letting my hands tremble slightly as I turned the pages, letting my eyes drift toward the window, as though the whole conversation exhausted me more than I could say. I told him I needed a few weeks to settle my affairs before signing anything final citing my age and the emotional weight of the decision, and he agreed without the slightest resistance, the patient generosity of a man who believes he has already won and can afford to be gracious about the timeline. Trevor came to see me 2 days after that alone without Slate beside him, for the first time since any of this had begun. He looked thinner than I remembered, hollowed out around the eyes, in a way that told me his own conscience had not been entirely quiet these past weeks. He said he had heard I was considering the sale, and that he thought it was probably for the best, given everything. I watched him say it, watched the particular strain in his face as the words came out, and understood that some small part of him was still hoping I might see through the whole arrangement and stop him before it went any further. I did not give him that chance. I told him I understood he had done what he needed to do, a sentence that meant something entirely different to me than it likely meant to him, and watched something in his shoulders loosen with relief he clearly believed I could not see. While I played the broken old man in public, Nora was working a very different angle behind the scenes. With Meridian's guard sufficiently lowered, believing the matter essentially settled, she was able to move more freely through the formal channels available to her investigation, quietly requesting the system audit logs from the dispensing software company. Itself, records that would show exactly which credentials had accessed my system and when. Evidence far harder to dispute than a signature that merely looked correct to the naked eye. She warned me it would take time, that companies like that did not move quickly, even under a legitimate subpoena, but that the request was in motion and could not easily be reversed. Then, on a Thursday evening, 9 days into my performance of surrender, I found an envelope waiting in my mailbox with no return address and no name on the front, only my own, written in block letters that told me nothing about who had written it. Inside was a single flash drive taped to an index card, and on that card, in the same careful block, letters were 4 words. "You need to see this." I sat at my kitchen table that night, with my old laptop open, the same table that had held so much of this ordeal already, and stared at a folder of internal clinic scheduling documents I had absolutely no legitimate way of possessing. Appointment logs, prescriber assignment sheets, a spreadsheet tracking patient visit frequency that seemed even at a glance to flag certain names for what the column header simply called enhanced management, a phrase that meant nothing on its surface and everything underneath it. I didn't know who had left that drive in my mailbox. I didn't know how they had known where I lived, or how they had gotten their hands on documents that clearly lived somewhere deep inside Meridian's own internal systems, protected by exactly the kind of access controls that had made Nora's investigation so slow and careful up to this point. Someone inside that clinic, someone with real access and real risk attached to what they were doing, had decided to help me, and had chosen to do it in complete silence, without a name, without a single word, beyond the 4 written on that card. I called Nora first thing the next morning and told her what had arrived. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, the particular quiet of someone doing careful math in her head. She told me that, if the documents held up under verification, they could accelerate everything considerably. Could give her exactly the internal corroboration the audit logs alone might otherwise take weeks to provide. I sat with that warning a long while after we hung up, looking at those 4 words on the index card again. You need to see this. Someone out there, hidden and afraid, had decided I was worth the risk. I did not yet know their name, but I understood staring at that careful block handwriting that whoever they were, they had already given me more courage than they probably realized. Trevor let himself in through the side door the following Tuesday, a habit I had never bothered to break him of back when I trusted him with a key to my house, as freely as I trusted him with everything else. I did not hear the door open. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop screen still glowing, the clinic scheduling documents spread open in 3 separate windows, a legal pad beside me covered in my own handwriting. Nora's name circled twice at the top of the page, along with a list of dates I had been cross-referencing against Harold's treatment history. I heard his voice before I heard his footsteps calling my name from the front hall, the easy way he always had, and I felt my whole body go rigid, with a fear sharper than anything the compliance officer or the newspaper headline had managed to produce in me. I had perhaps 4 seconds before he would round the corner into my kitchen and see exactly what I had spent the last several days building. Evidence that would instantly unmask every ounce of the broken old man performance I had worked so hard to sustain. I closed the laptop with one motion and slid the legal pad beneath a stack of unopened mail in what felt like a single, desperate breath. And by the time Trevor stepped into the doorway, I was simply an old man, sitting at his kitchen table, hands folded, looking up at him, with what I hoped passed for tired surprise, rather than the genuine terror still hammering behind my ribs. He said he had come to drop off some paperwork from Slate's office documents I would need to review before our next meeting, and he set a thin folder on the counter, while his eyes drifted almost lazily toward the closed laptop, sitting a little too close to the edge of the table for a man who claimed to spend his days doing nothing but resting. I watched him look at it a beat longer than felt entirely comfortable, and I made myself hold his gaze rather than glance nervously toward the mail pile hiding my legal pad, because a guilty man looks away, and an innocent one simply waits. He crossed the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water from my tap, the way he had done 100 times before as a friend, rather than a visitor. And for one terrible moment, I thought he might set his hand down, directly on top of the mail pile, might shift it aside looking for a coaster, the way he always used to. He did not. He leaned against the counter instead, glass in hand, studying me with an expression I could not quite place, somewhere between concern and something more searching underneath it. He asked almost too casually whether I had been keeping busy. I told him I had been sorting through old records, the kind of thing a man does when he is preparing to close a chapter of his life for good, and watched something in his face soften with what looked uncomfortably close to genuine sympathy, the particular tenderness of a man who believes he understands exactly what grief looks like from the outside. He did not push further. He gathered himself after another moment, told me Slate would be in touch about scheduling, and left the way he had come through the side door without ever asking why an old man supposedly resigning himself to defeat needed a laptop open at his kitchen table on a weekday afternoon. I sat very still for a long time after that door clicked shut, my heart still going harder than it should have at my age, understanding with sudden and complete clarity exactly how thin the margin had been. One more second of hesitation, one wrong angle of his eyes toward that legal pad, and every piece of ground Nora and I had carefully built over these past weeks might have collapsed in an instant, taking with it every patient still standing unknowingly in harm's way. The formal notice arrived by certified mail 3 days later, and I signed for it myself, standing on my own front porch in the cold, my breath fogging the same way it had that first Tuesday morning, weeks earlier, when the whole nightmare began. The State Board of Pharmacy had scheduled a formal administrative hearing for 3 weeks from that Friday, a public proceeding where the full findings of the investigation would be presented and a final determination made regarding my license and my future in this profession. Attached to the notice separately was a letter from Slate's attorney confirming that Meridian intended to finalize the purchase agreement for my shop on that same date, positioning the sale as evidence of my own acceptance of the board's findings, a tidy bow tied around the entire fabricated story. I understood reading that letter twice at my own kitchen table exactly what Slate intended that day to become. It was meant to be the final act of his story, the moment a broken old man signed away both his license and his shop in the same afternoon, closing the book on Harold's death with a clean and simple ending that would satisfy any federal auditor who came looking. I called Nora that same evening and read her the date over the phone, and I heard her exhale slowly on the other end, doing the same silent math I had already done twice myself. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to make certain that when that hearing room finally opened, it was his story that collapsed inside it, and not mine. A soft knock came at my back door, 11 days into that 3-week countdown, well past 10 at night, the kind of hour that carries its own particular weight of urgency. I opened it, expecting Nora, or perhaps nothing at all, some trick of the wind against an old house. Instead, my son stood on the step in the porch, light his coat collar turned up against the cold, glancing back over his shoulder, toward the empty road behind him, the way a man glances when he is genuinely afraid of being followed. I stood there a moment simply looking at him, unable to fully process that Daniel, who had spent weeks giving me nothing warmer than a flat and careful voice over the phone, was now standing on my back step at an hour like this. I asked him what was wrong. He did not answer right away. He stepped past me into the kitchen, waited until I had closed the door behind him, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, told me it was him. He was the one who had left the drive in my mailbox. I do not know exactly what I expected to feel in that moment, but it was not the particular flood of relief and confusion, and something close to grief, that actually moved through me. Standing in my own kitchen, looking at a son I had spent weeks believing had turned away from me at the exact moment I needed him most. I asked him why. I asked him why, if he had known something was wrong, if he had gone to such lengths to help me from the shadows. He had let me believe for all these weeks that he had abandoned me. He sat down heavily at the table, the same table that had held so much of this ordeal already, and told me the whole of it slowly, the way a man tells a story he has been carrying alone for far too long. He said he had noticed the pattern at the clinic months before Harold ever died, small things at first prescription volumes that seemed unusually high for a practice, their size patients returning more frequently than their conditions seemed to warrant. He had started keeping his own quiet records almost a year earlier, terrified of what he was seeing, but unsure who he could trust with it, inside a workplace where everyone above him answered in one way or another to Meridian. When the accusation against me surfaced, he said his fear had doubled in an instant. If he showed the smallest sign of siding with me publicly, if he defended his own father too loudly in a break room full of Meridian employees, he risked losing the access that let him keep gathering evidence, and worse, he risked someone connecting the dots back to what he had already collected. He had decided in the days right after my suspension that the only way to actually help me was to disappear from my life as visibly as possible, so that no one watching either of us would ever think to look for a connection between his silence and the drive that eventually appeared in my mailbox. I sat across from him, letting all of this settle into me, and felt something in my chest loosen that had been clenched tight for weeks without my fully realizing it. But underneath that relief sat something older, something that had nothing to do with Meridian or Harold or any of the events of these past weeks. I asked him, my voice rougher than I intended, whether this was truly the reason for the distance between us, or whether it went back further than that, back to the year his mother died. Daniel's eyes went bright and wet in the kitchen light, and for a long moment he did not answer. When he finally spoke, he told me he had never forgiven himself for those last weeks with Ruth, for the argument we'd had over her care when he had wanted to bring in a specialist from the city, and I had insisted on keeping her here in her own bed, surrounded by everything familiar, because I could not bear the thought of her dying somewhere that did not smell like our own home. He said he had spent 4 years quietly believing I blamed him for pushing, and that he had let that belief build a wall between us far higher than it ever needed to be. I told him my own voice, breaking in a way I had not allowed it to break through any of the weeks that came before this one, that I had never once blamed him. I told him I had made that decision about her care alone, out of my own fear and my own stubbornness, and that watching him pull away afterward had felt like one more piece of Ruth slipping out of my hands that I had never known how to ask him to give back. We sat there together for a long while, 2 men who had spent 4 years grieving the same woman from opposite sides of a silence neither of us had known how to break, finally saying the things that silence had kept buried. It was well past midnight before Daniel finally rose from the table, telling me he needed to get back before his absence raised any questions, and reminding me with a seriousness that steadied us both that he still had 11 days left to gather anything more he could find before the hearing arrived. I stood at my back door and watched him disappear down the dark road toward his car, feeling for the first time in weeks something that resembled hope rather than mere resolve and understanding, as I closed the door against the cold that, whatever happened in that hearing room, I would not be walking into it as alone as I had believed myself to be. I walked into that hearing room the way I had promised. Nora I would, shoulders slightly stooped, eyes lowered, every visible piece of me arranged to look like a man who had finally run out of fight. The room was fuller than I expected for a small county administrative matter, folding chairs lined up in uneven rows. Half the town packed into a space meant for a fraction of that number, drawn by the same appetite for spectacle that had filled the diner and the church pews with whispers for weeks. I felt their eyes on me as I made my way to the front, and I let them see exactly what they had already decided. They would see an old man beaten down by the weight of his own mistake. Slate sat near the front with 2 attorneys flanking him, dressed in the same easy confidence he had worn into my shop that first afternoon, occasionally leaning to murmur something that made one of his lawyers smile. Trevor sat further back alone, his hands folded so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone pale, looking like a man who had spent the entire walk from the parking lot rehearsing a story he no longer fully believed himself. The hearing officer opened the proceeding with the flat procedural language such things always seem to require, and for the first 20 minutes, it unfolded exactly as Slate clearly expected it. To the board's compliance officer walking the room through the original transaction record, the timestamp, the signature, the narrative of an aging pharmacist whose judgment had finally failed him in the worst possible way. I sat through it with my head bowed, letting the story build itself in the direction Slate had spent months constructing, waiting for the moment Nora and I had planned for. That moment came when Nora rose to present the board with the results of the subpoenaed audit logs, and I felt the entire room shift in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She explained in the clear, unhurried language of someone who has waited a long time to say something correctly that the dispensing software company's own internal metadata showed the fraudulent transaction had not originated from my personal credentials at the pharmacy counter at all, but had been created 3 days after the fact, remotely using a secondary administrative login issued specifically to Trevor Nash as junior partner. The timestamp was precise down to the second. The access point traced to a device registered under Trevor's name. A murmur moved through those folding chairs like wind through dry grass, and I watched several faces I had known my entire life turn slowly for the first time in weeks, back toward me instead of away. Carol Ann Whitfield, sitting near the back with her hands pressed to her mouth, met my eyes across that crowded room for the first time since the morning she had crossed the street to avoid me. Nora followed that with the conference documentation laying my hotel receipt and the attendee roster from Rolla across the presentation table for the board to examine, directly walking them through the simple arithmetic of distance and time that placed me an hour and more away from my own counter, at the precise moment the original story required me to be standing behind it. She brought in alongside it a forensic handwriting analyst who had examined the disputed signature against 30 years of my documented handwriting, and who testified plainly and without hedging that the signature bore the markers of careful tracing, rather than natural signing, consistent with someone reproducing my hand from a reference sample, rather than my own pen moving freely across the page. I lifted my head partway through that testimony, no longer entirely able to maintain the posture of defeat, and found Trevor staring down at his own folded hands, his shoulders beginning to shake in small, contained movements that told me his composure was cracking well before anyone asked him a single direct question. Toward the back of the room near the door, I caught a glimpse of Della May's broad shoulders, and a few rows from her, Daniel sitting perfectly still, careful not to let his eyes meet mine, still playing his own quiet part in all of this. When the hearing officer finally turned to him and asked him to respond to the metadata evidence, Trevor's voice came out thin and unsteady, offering an explanation about routine system maintenance that even I, watching from across the room, could see was collapsing before it fully left his mouth. He glanced toward Slate as he spoke, the instinctive glance of a drowning man looking for a rope that was not going to be thrown. Slate did not move. He sat with his hands folded calmly on the table in front of him, his expression arranged into something between concern and mild surprise. The same practiced stillness I remembered from the day he sat across my own kitchen table and told me grief has a way of changing a man's mind. When one of the board members turned the question toward him, asking whether Meridian had any knowledge of irregularities in Trevor's handling of these records, he answered without a single visible tremor, expressing shock and disappointment at what he called a young employee's individual and deeply regrettable choices. Choices Meridian had no possible way of anticipating or condoning. I sat there, watching him deflect the entire weight of what had just been proven onto Trevor's narrow shoulders, watching him position his own company as another victim of one desperate man's poor judgment, and understood, even as the room around me buzzed with the sound of a story finally cracking open, that Slate still believed he had one layer of protection left standing between himself and everything Nora and I actually knew. Nora asked the hearing officer for a brief recess before continuing, and when the room reconvened 20 minutes later, she was not standing at the presentation table alone. Daniel walked in beside her, still in the plain civilian clothes he had worn, to observe the proceedings quietly from the back row, and I watched a ripple of confusion move through the room as people realized the pharmacist's estranged son was about to speak. Daniel identified himself to the board as a registered nurse currently employed at the Meridian Clinic, and told them in a voice steadier than I had heard from him in years that he had spent nearly a year documenting a pattern of prescribing behavior he had grown increasingly alarmed by long before his own father was ever accused of anything. He submitted through Nora a compiled record of patient visit logs and dosage escalation patterns across 11 separate elderly patients under the same small group of prescribers. Harold's name sitting plainly among them, no longer as an isolated tragedy, but as one data point inside a pattern any careful observer could see, repeating itself again and again. The room had gone entirely silent by the time he finished, the particular silence of a crowd realizing the story they had gathered to watch was far larger and far darker than the one they had come expecting. A man near the back rose and identified himself as a federal investigator with the Drug Enforcement Administration, present at Nora's request, and informed the board that given what had just been entered into the record, his office would be opening a formal investigation into Meridian Health Group's prescribing practices across the entire region, effective immediately. I watched Slate's composure finally begin to slip, not in any dramatic collapse, but in the small, involuntary way a man's face changes when he understands all at once that every door he believed remained open has just quietly closed. His attorneys leaned in close, whispering urgently, and he stopped speaking entirely, the practiced smoothness that had carried him through every previous exchange, abandoning him at the exact moment he needed it most. The board did not take long after that to reach its determination. My license was reinstated in full, the suspension vacated my name, formally cleared of any wrongdoing in connection with Harold's death. Trevor was referred for criminal prosecution on charges related to record falsification and fraud, though the hearing officer noted, reading from prepared language, that the board would be forwarding its full findings to federal prosecutors regarding Meridian's broader culpability in the matter. The walk out of that building felt entirely different from the walk in. People I had known my whole life pressed close around me in the parking lot, offering apologies that came tumbling out faster than I could properly receive them. Hands on my shoulder, a few faces openly wet with tears they did not bother hiding. Carol Ann Whitfield was among them, gripping both my hands in hers, and telling me over and over how ashamed she was of that morning on the sidewalk. I accepted what I could of it graciously, though some part of me remained too exhausted, too hollowed out by these past weeks, to feel the full flood of vindication I might have expected to feel. Trevor found me near my truck as the crowd began to thin, standing a careful distance away. His eyes red-rimmed, and his whole body seeming to fold in on itself, the way a man's body folds when shame has finally caught up with every choice that led him here. He did not offer excuses. He simply said my name and then said he was sorry. 2 words that could not possibly carry the full weight of what they were meant to hold, and waited for whatever judgment I intended to deliver. I looked at him for a long moment, this young man I had trained with my own 2 hands, who had crouched at a frightened child's eye level and made an inhaler feel like a game, who had also, in a moment of desperate weakness, sold a piece of his own soul to a company that understood exactly how to purchase it. I felt the anger still sitting somewhere inside my chest, real and earned, but underneath it I found something else waiting as well, something closer to grief than fury. I told him that what he had done to me was unforgivable, in the way that specific act would always remain a wound, but that I didn't believe unforgivable acts made unforgivable men, provided a man was willing to spend the rest of his life proving otherwise. I told him I hoped for his wife's sake, and for whatever remained of his own conscience, that he would use whatever came next to become someone worth that second chance, though I made clear I would not be the one handing it to him personally. Not now, perhaps not ever. He nodded, unable to speak further, and walked away across that parking lot alone, carrying a weight I suspected would follow him for a very long time. I drove home that evening in a kind of quiet I had not experienced in weeks. The radio off the windows cracked, despite the cold, watching the familiar shape of Marlin Creek slide past in the fading light, every storefront and street corner, looking for the first time in a long while, like a town I still recognized as mine. The storm that had swept through my life these past weeks had finally broken, leaving behind the particular stillness that follows any real reckoning, equal parts exhaustion, and something that, if I sat with it long enough, might eventually grow into peace. The bell over my door rang out its same old note on a cold Monday morning 3 weeks later, the exact sound it had made every single day for 31 years. And I stood just inside the threshold for a long moment, simply letting myself listen to it. There is a particular kind of gratitude that only arrives after you have genuinely believed something was lost for good. And I felt the full weight of that gratitude standing there in my own shop, morning light falling across shelves I had once feared I would never see again. Daniel helped me reopen that day, taking the morning off from the clinic where he still worked, though. Not, he told me with a small, tired smile, for very much longer. He had already begun quietly looking at nursing positions in Springfield, at hospitals, with no connection whatsoever to Meridian, ready to build the next chapter of his career. Somewhere, the ground beneath him did not require constant watching. He hung a small brass bell of his own choosing on a hook behind the register. That morning, a quiet private joke between the two of us about doors that ring true and doors that do not. We spent that first morning together, restocking shelves and greeting the steady trickle of townspeople who came through, some for prescriptions, more than a few, simply to shake my hand and tell me in their own halting way how glad they were to see the lights on again. I placed a new volume beside the register that morning, the 32nd, in a line that now stretched the length of my back room, and I opened it to its first blank page, with a kind of ceremony I had not felt since the day my father handed me my very first one. I have thought a great deal these past weeks about what that ledger actually represents beyond simple habit or old-fashioned caution. It is not really about the ink or the paper at all. It is about the discipline of writing a true thing down slowly and by hand in a world that increasingly moves too fast for truth to keep up with it. A digital record can be altered by anyone with the right access and the wrong intentions. My own handwriting, built over 3 decades of careful repetition, could not be so easily rewritten by a stranger's hand. I think about Harold often, more now, than I did even in the rawest days right after his death, because I finally understand the full shape of what actually happened to him. He did not die because a system failed by accident. He died because a system was allowed to prioritize profit over the quiet, unglamorous work of actually caring for people, and because enough people along the way chose convenience over the harder, slower work of doing right by the person in front of them. I think the best way I can honor him now is by refusing to let that same convenience ever creep into how I run my own small corner of this profession. What I learned through all of this, more than anything about forged signatures or corrupted systems, is something my late wife tried to teach me for 43 years, and that I only now feel I have fully learned. Trust is not a soft thing. It is not weakness, and it is not naivety. Real trust, the kind worth building a whole life around, requires the courage to keep showing up honestly, even after someone has shown you exactly how badly that honesty can be exploited. I could have let this town's brief betrayal harden something permanent in me. Instead, I choose every single morning I unlock this door to believe that most people given the chance to see the truth clearly will choose to stand on the right side of it, eventually the way this whole town eventually stood beside me. Daniel and I do not talk about his mother the way we used to avoid talking about her, carefully skirting the subject, the way two men circle a wound neither wants to touch. We talk about her often, now easily, the way a family should be able to speak about the people they have lost. And I think she would be proud of the man he has become, prouder still of the courage it took him to spend a year quietly protecting people he had never even met, at a cost to himself he never once mentioned until the night he finally needed me to understand it. If there is one thing I would ask anyone listening to carry away from this, it is simply this. Look closely at the people you trust with your most important records, your most private vulnerabilities, the parts of your life you cannot easily verify yourself. Not with suspicion, but with the same careful attention I give to every single line in my own ledger. And if you ever find yourself standing where I once stood, wrongly accused and utterly alone, do not mistake the silence of a frightened town for the final truth. Sometimes the people who seem to have abandoned you are quietly working the hardest to bring you home. If this story reminded you that the truth, however long buried, still has a way of finding its way back into the light, I would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you have ever stood alone against a lie the whole world seemed to believe, I hope you will tell that story too. Down in the comments where someone else who needs to hear it might be listening.